Boa noite a todos e todas. É um super prazer estar aqui com vocês essa noite para mais uma live do Avistar Conecta. Dessa vez, agora já pertinho do Avistar presencial. Eu sei que deve estar todo mundo super animado para essa ocasião que está chegando e que a gente vinha esperando já há 3 anos, né? E hoje é um prazer enorme também apresentar e trazer para vocês a Jennifer Ackerman. A Jennifer Ackerman, ela é uma escritora que faz divulgação científica para diversas revistas importantes, né? E ela escreveu um best-seller do New York Times, que é A Inteligência das Aves, que a gente vai falar hoje aqui, e também 2 outros livros que não foram traduzidos para o português, o The Bird Way e um outro livro sobre aves limícolas. E ela está trabalhando ainda num 4º livro sobre aves. Então, hoje a gente vai ter ela aqui para contar isso tudo para nós. Eu espero que vocês gostem muito. Eu estou super empolgada. Então, vamos lá? Hello, Jennifer. How are you?
I'm very well, Erika. Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to have you here. And I'm sure I'm talking in the name of everyone else that is watching today. I think so. Jennifer is a birder, a bird watcher, and a scientific writer. Wrote this amazing book that was translated in more than 20 different idioms, including Portuguese. And she's going to talk now for us a little bit about, or some about her publications and her stories of birds. So go ahead, Jennifer. Now it's with you.
Thank you, Erika. And Daniela, would you bring my slides up, please? Thank you. So I'm just so delighted to be here, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor. And I do wish I could be there in person, but I'm delighted to be joining you virtually. So many thanks to Guto and the other organizers of Avistar for having me here tonight. So I've been writing about nature and science for more than 3 decades, and I've written about whales and dragonflies, genetics, the human body, oceans and microbes, but my books on birds and their intelligent behavior have really been a high point for me. I've loved birds since I was a child, and I went birdwatching with my father in Washington, D.C., and I just loved finding birds, identifying them, figuring out what family they belong to. But it was really later as a science writer that I discovered an even greater fascination in learning about bird brains and behavior. How do they communicate? How do they forage and build nests? How do they raise their young? And why do they sing so gloriously? How do they learn their songs? I wanted to explore what was going on in their minds while they do these things. What are they thinking, or are they thinking? And what I learned working on this book was really a revelation. First, about the surprising brains of birds and their quite astonishing mental abilities, but also about the nature of intelligence and what we might learn about it by exploring how other creatures think. I think we're really in the midst of a scientific shift in our understanding of the minds of other animals, and birds have really been a big piece of that progress. Until quite recently, we thought that a bird's behavior was driven pretty much solely by instinct, and that its brain was so small and primitive that it was capable of only the simplest mental processes. So this illustration shows how we used to view the bird brain and how we see it now. So the bird brain is on the left compared with the human brain on the right. And the old classic view is at the top. The new, more modern view is below it. And the purple shows areas of the brain that are dedicated to purely instinctive behavior. So that's eating, drinking, mating. And the green shows areas involved in cognition and complex cognition. That's decision-making, problem-solving, planning. And intelligence is really the ability to solve problems using cognition rather than instinct. So if you just look at this dramatic shift in our view of the makeup of the bird brain from mostly purple instinctive areas to large green areas of higher thinking. And scientists now understand that in many ways, bird brains are really not so different from our brains. About 75% of the human forebrain is made up of cortex that's responsible for high-level thinking. And now it's clear that the same is true for some birds, particularly songbirds and parrots. They have as much cortex-like forebrain as we do. It's just not organized the way that ours is. So you can really see how our understanding of the bird brain has changed radically. And so has our view of bird behavior. In the past several years, scientists conducting studies in the lab and in the field have come to realize that many species of birds are capable of far more intelligent behavior than we ever imagined, using cognitive skills that are in many ways closer to our primate relatives than to their reptilian ones. So I say to people, to call someone a bird brain used to be an insult, but not anymore. Now we know birds can think logically and reason on par with young children. They can solve complex problems they've never seen before. They Birds remember the past and plan for the future. They give gifts. They eavesdrop. And they communicate in ways that resemble language. So the calls of our chickadees, for instance, are considered by scientists among the most sophisticated and precise systems of communication in any land animal. And like other birds, chickadees they use certain calls to maintain contact with a mate or to announce a nearby food source. But the really remarkable language-like calls they use are the ones they use to warn of predators. And scientists have found that these warning calls, they specify both the type of predator, whether it's arriving from the air or from the land, and also the magnitude of threat that predator represents. So, for example, a soft, high-pitched seat call, that may actually signal a threat on the wing like a shrike or a sharp-shinned hawk. And that seat call, it kind of hangs disembodied in the air. It's very hard for the hawk or the shrike to locate it. So the chickadee can sound the alarm of sort of urgent danger, warning other birds to quickly flee without being detected itself. The chickadee dee call that gives the bird its name, that warns of a perched predator like an owl sitting in a tree. And these are hard, rapid, far-carrying notes that are designed for the ears of neighboring birds to summon them to mob the predator. And here's the thing, the number of those little DDDs at the end of its call, those actually indicate the predator's size and hence the degree of threat that it represents. So more DDDs means a smaller, more agile, and therefore, to a chickadee, more dangerous predator. And other species understand the chickadee's language and they heed the warning, joining in the mobbing. Now, the fork-tailed drongo of southern Africa uses its voice for deceptive purposes. This bird can mimic the alarm calls from a range of 45 different birds and mammals, meerkats, jackals, mongooses. the drongo knows exactly which alarm call belongs to which animal. So, for instance, if a mongoose is eating something delicious, the drongo will blast out the special alarm call of the mongoose. And the mongoose hears it, thinks it's another mongoose warning of a predator in the area. So it drops its food and flees to cover. And then the drongo swoops in and snatches up the poor critter's meal. Then there's the phenomenon of song learning in the bird world. Songbirds learn their songs the way that we learn language through a remarkable process called vocal learning. And it's very rare in the animal world, and it involves listening, imitating, and practicing, just like learning to speak. In fact, Charles Darwin called birdsong the nearest analogy to human language. Through vocal learning, mockingbirds can learn to mimic the songs of hundreds of species of birds. And brown thrashers can learn close to 1,000 songs of other species. So these are examples of some of the sophisticated communication skills of some birds. Other birds have astonishing memories, like the Clark's nutcracker. Now, this bird, which lives in the high mountains of the West in the US, really puts to shame our own ability to remember where we put things. The nutcracker caches its food for future use, and it can bury up to 30,000 pine seeds in thousands of locations over dozens of square miles, and remember where it put its individual caches several months later, even though the landscape may be dramatically changed by snow, leaves, or shifting rocks and soil. The nutcrackers go straight to the locations of their individual stashes. Now, just imagine remembering the locations of thousands of these stashes. Some birds, like the California scrub jay, they appear to possess what's called episodic memory, and that's the ability to remember the specifics of past events. These scrub jays, they're also caching birds, but they cache a variety of foods. So some of these are long-lasting, like nuts and seeds, and some are perishable, like fruit or worms. Now, these birds can remember not only where they buried their food, but what they buried in a particular spot and when they buried it there, so that they can retrieve first those foods that are quick to spoil, like fresh fruit, insects, worms. And this ability to remember the what, where, and when of an event suggests to some scientists the possibility that these jays may actually be able to travel back into the past in their own minds. And that's an ability that was once considered uniquely human. Even pigeons have truly impressive memories. Pigeons can be trained to learn and recall hundreds of pictures, storing them in their long-term memory for as long as a year. I think these birds deserve a lot more credit than we give them. Pigeons, they may not be capable of the sort of complex communication that a chickadee is, or mental time travel like a scrub jay, but they are exceptional learners, and they're extremely gifted at making visual distinctions. For instance, they can learn to distinguish different human faces and recognize them later. They can also learn to distinguish paintings of different artistic styles and can correctly categorize a painting they've never seen before, putting a Renoir in with the Impressionists and a Braque in with the Cubists. They've even been trained to distinguish between normal and cancerous tissue in mammograms, sometimes with more accuracy than a trained technician. So birds, they do all of this with a brain so tiny it would easily fit inside a nut. Well, how is that possible? Well, we've known for some time that brain size is not the only or even the main indicator of intelligence. And the truth is that some species of birds have very large brains for their body size, just as we humans do. It's called relative brain size. Moreover, what really matters in the intelligent brain is the density of nerve cells or neurons. And while the brains of birds, they may be small overall, it turns out that in many species, they're densely packed with neurons. Parrots, Recently, Brazilian neuroscientist Susana Herculano Uzel, she counted the number of neurons in the brains of parrots like the blue and yellow macaw, as well as corvids, ravens, crows, jays, and other kinds of songbirds. And she was really shocked by what she found. Bird brains pack surprisingly high numbers of neurons, really high, she told me. In fact, the brains of parrots and corvids, they have twice as many neurons as similar-sized primate brains, and 4 times as many neurons as mammal brains of the same size. Now, parrots and corvids have especially high numbers of neurons in their large forebrain, and that's the domain of analytical thought and higher forms of learning. This is the charming and cunning African gray parrot named Alex, who partnered with Harvard scientist Irene Pepperberg to show the world that some birds, at least, appear to have intellectual abilities rivaling those of our primate relatives and forever changing our view of the avian brain. So Alex could grasp the meaning of hundreds of words and use them himself in a meaningful way. He could understand abstract ideas, such as the concept of zero. He knew his colors and shapes and numbers. He could do basic math. So you could ask Alex, how many red objects are there on a tray full of colored objects? And he would correctly answer 2 or 4 or 6. And if you asked him what an object was made of, he would feel it with his beak and tongue and correctly answer wood or plastic. And Alex was not the only wickedly smart African gray parrot. More recently, Irene Pepperberg has worked with this parrot, Griffin, and Griffin has shown that his species can even recognize shapes that are hidden in this sort of optical illusion. Griffin sees a triangle just as we do and can name the number of corners in the shape. This goes beyond, well, way beyond mere mimicry. But these birds have a genius for this too. This is Throckmorton, who's an African gray parrot in my book, who belongs to a couple I know here in where I live in Virginia. Their names are Bob and Karen. And Throckmorton, he uses his talent for mimicry to tease his family mercilessly. So he can imitate Bob and Karen's voices so accurately that they themselves don't know whether they're being hailed by their bird or their spouse. And he also mimics the different rings of their telephone. And one of his favorite games is to summon Bob from the garage by imitating his cell phone ring. Bob drops everything, comes running into the kitchen to get his phone, and Throckmorton answers the call in Bob's voice. He says, "Hello? Uh-huh, uh-huh." Throckmorton really enjoys this game quite a lot, but Bob not so much. The bird brains have a different architecture than our brains. Their neurons are arranged in little bulb-like clusters, kind of like a head of garlic, while ours are arranged in layers, more like a lasagna. And we used to think that animals needed a layered cortex to be intelligent. But scientists have discovered that what is really critical to intelligence is the connections between neurons, how they're networked and wired together. And in this way, bird brains are similar to our brains in some ways, with some very similar neural pathways. For example, songbirds use neural pathways to learn their songs that are similar to those we use to learn to speak. Crows and mockingbirds use the same neural circuits we use to recognize human faces. And hummingbirds use circuits like ours in the part of the brain known as the hippocampus to keep track of the location of individual flowers. So birds have really taught us there is clearly more than one way to wire a clever brain. So maybe the question is not, are birds smart, but rather, why are they smart? Why has intelligence evolved in birds? Because here's the thing, brains that are really dense with neurons, they're real energy hogs. They're energetically very expensive to run. So what is it about the lives of birds that calls for this kind of expensive intelligence? Well, birds may be smart for some of the same reasons that we are, because we've had to solve difficult, ecological problems. How do I find good shelter? How do I get food under difficult circumstances? How do I defend my territory? How do I find my way to wintering and breeding grounds? And how do I find a safe place to mate? This is actually, I think, not such a safe place. These are oxpeckers who are mating on the back of an African buffalo. Like us, birds have also had to solve difficult social problems. How do I get along with others? How do I elevate my status in my group? How do I communicate with my mate and my flock? And how do I pick the best mate, the best parent for my offspring? So, in my book, I define this term genius as a knack for knowing what you're doing, for catching on to your surroundings, making sense of things, and figuring out how to solve your problems, whether they're ecological problems or social problems. And it's really something that birds have been doing for a very long time. This is a red-crowned crane doing a courtship dance in Hokkaido. And cranes belong to an ancient group of birds that first appeared in the age of dinosaurs. And as a class, birds have been around for more than 100 million years. They're really one of nature's great success stories. They've invented new strategies for survival. They're really their own distinctive brands of ingenuity, which in some respects at least seem to outpace our own. There are well over 10,000 different species of birds living on our planet. That's more than double the number of mammal species. And in judging the overall intelligence of animals, sometimes scientists look at how successful they are at surviving and reproducing in many different kinds of environments. And by this measure, birds trump nearly all vertebrates, including fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. They live everywhere around the globe, from desert to ice pack, from rainforest to cities, suburbs, and farmlands. Or consider numbers, pure numbers, as a measure of evolutionary success. So in 2021, scientists estimated the total number of wild birds on the planet, and they came up with between 50 and 430 billion individual birds. So I did the math, and it comes out to about 60 birds per person. So I don't know, to say that humans are evolutionarily more successful or advanced really depends on how you define those terms. After all, evolutionary success is about survival. It's about learning to solve the problems of your environment and your social world. And that's something that birds have done, I think, surpassingly well for a very long time. Which to my mind makes it really all the more surprising that many of us, even those of us who love birds, have found it sometimes difficult to swallow the idea that they may be bright in ways that we just can't imagine. And maybe it's because birds, they're so unlike people and so distantly related to us that it's difficult for us to fully appreciate their mental capabilities. So birds are dinosaurs. They're descended from a lucky line that survived the meteor strike that killed nearly all of their big cousins. This is the skeleton of a Sinosauropteryx, the first discovered dinosaur with feathers. And we are mammals, related to those timid shrew-like creatures that emerged from the dinosaurs' shadows only after most of those beasts had died off. And while our mammal relatives were busy growing, birds, by the same process of natural selection, were busy shrinking, diminishing in size from their 300-pound ancestors to birds like the hummingbird, the bee hummingbird, which is the smallest bird on the planet. And while we were learning to stand up and walk on 2 feet, birds were perfecting lightness and flight. And while our neurons were sorting themselves into cortical layers to generate complex behavior, birds were devising another neural architecture altogether, different from a mammal's, but in some ways at least equally sophisticated and highly efficient. They were figuring out how the world works, and all the while evolution was fine-tuning and sculpting their brains, giving their minds the quite magnificent mental powers they have today. So my book, it explores the Einsteins of the bird world, the parrots and corvids, but also the less celebrated but still surprisingly bright species all around us. Titmice, wrens, grackles, warblers, sparrows, and highlight some of their extraordinary mental abilities: technical, social, spatial, musical, artistic, and adaptive. So I thought I'd just bring you along on parts of the journey that I took to learn about some of these impressive mental skills and how scientists study them. For my research, I traveled around the globe to investigate these new discoveries about bird intelligence and to visit with ornithologists in the field. And I began on the Caribbean island of Barbados. It's the laboratory home of Louis Lefebvre, who's a professor at McGill University. And he's the scientist who invented the first kind of a scale to measure bird intelligence. Now, I will say that if you're a birder interested in adding exotic species to your list, Barbados is just not the place for you. It's home to only 37 different birds, and I think 7 of those are introduced species. However, if you're interested in observing bird behavior close up, as Louis is, Barbados is a kind of paradise. The birds here are very tame and easy to observe. These are carob grackles, and they're dunking dog kibble in a puddle on Louis's deck to soften it sufficiently to eat. Now, this is a kind of intentional food processing, Louis told me, and crows do it too. Barbados is also home to a pair of species, 2 little brown birds. It's the Barbados bullfinch on the left, which is kind of the house sparrow of Barbados, and the black-faced grassquit on the right. Now, these 2 species are genetically nearly identical, but they seem to be radically different in their intelligence. And the contrast between them has provided Louis with a quite beautiful natural experiment. The bullfinch is a master problem solver, and it became notorious on the island for its ability to open all kinds of tricky boxes and packages. The grassquit, on the other hand, seems to lack all problem-solving abilities. It has just one mode of activity, which involves pecking for seeds in a field, and it's just completely averse to anything new or unfamiliar. So how can 2 birds that share so much, genes, habitat, brain size, etc., how can they be so different? What makes one bird smart and inventive and another apparently dull? Well, you have to come at these questions from different angles, Louis told me. You have to begin in the field with your boots on the ground and really look closely at a bird's behavior in the wild. Then he said you try to get inside their heads. And researchers like Louis are doing just this. They're looking at the behavior of birds in their natural habitat. They're conducting cognitive studies in a lab with captive birds, putting them through these batteries of cognitive tests. And they're probing bird brains themselves and what goes on inside them, the genes and cells that make them tick. And it's a sort of ambitious science that's going on everywhere in bird cognition research to try to understand the mysteries of the bird mind. Now, Louis would be the first to tell you that intelligence is really hard to measure in any animal. The field is still very much in its infancy. There's no standard intelligence test for birds. So scientists try to devise puzzles that reveal a bird's cognitive abilities, like this one, which is asking a bullfinch to open a tricky container and measuring how long it takes to do so, and how readily the bird changes its tactics in attempting to solve the problem. It's a fairly good cognitive test. However, it's a highly artificial situation, laboratory setting with a human-made device, and it's hard to be sure just what you're measuring. Is it a bird's problem-solving abilities or simply its willingness to try new things, its kind of boldness? So Louis had another idea. The intelligence scale that he developed is based on a bird's behavior in the wild. Does it, how inventive is the species? Does it tend to find new creative solutions to problems in its environment? Does it try new foods? These behaviors are indicators of what's called behavioral flexibility. And this is one fairly reliable measure of intelligence. It's really the ability to do something new, to change your behavior in response to new circumstances and new challenges. And ornithological journals are full of short reports of this kind of clever, innovative, flexible behavior in birds. And what Louis did is that he combed through journals of the past 75 years and collected 2,300 reports of these sorts of behaviors in birds of different species. The classic example is the tit, both the blue tit and the great tit, which almost defeated the milk industry in Great Britain by learning to puncture the little foil bottle cap on milk bottles delivered to people's stoops, their front steps, so that he could drink the lovely cream that collects at the top. This clever strategy quickly spread to tits all over the United Kingdom. But there are thousands of other examples of this kind of behavior. Green herons using dead insects as bait, placing them on the surface to lure fish. Jays flushing ants from an anthill. And I think maybe my favorite report was of bald eagles in northern Arizona that found a stash of dead minnows that were frozen under the surface of an ice-covered lake. And the eagles chipped holes in the ice, and then they jumped up and down on the surface of the lake using their body weight to push the minnows up through the holes so they could feast on them. Then there were the house sparrows of New Zealand who that learned to open the doors, the automatic doors in a cafeteria by hovering in front of the sensor or by landing on top of it, and they would lean forward until their heads triggered the sensor. And the observers saw the birds do this 15, 16 times in 45 minutes. They were popping in and out of the doors to snatch crumbs from the cafeteria floor. So from these reports, Louis assembled a database of innovative behavior that was divided up by bird family. Then he ranked the bird families according to their capacity for flexible, innovative behavior. So what were the smartest birds at the top of Louis' scale? Well, no surprise, they were corvids, ravens, crows, jays, magpies, parrots, and birds of prey. Also herons and gulls, and a surprising large number of small birds, such as sparrows, tits, and finches. Now, what were the birds at the bottom of Louis' scale? Well, they were turkeys, quails, ostriches, and the emu, the national bird of Australia. This caused a bit of an uproar when it was announced in the Sydney papers. But I want to emphasize this is just one measure of intelligence, so it may be unfair to malign any of the birds at the bottom of this particular scale. As I mentioned, I traveled to many places and spoke with researchers from all over the world, but the highlight was my trip to this tiny tropical island in the Southwest Pacific, not far from Australia, called New Caledonia. And it is the home of the New Caledonian crow, which is arguably the world's smartest bird. This crow is renowned for its extraordinary problem-solving abilities and for its capacity to make and use its own complex tools, which rivals the big primate tool makers like chimps and orangutans. Now, these New Caledonian crows, they live on their little island of New Caledonia and nowhere else on the planet. And the island is very sparsely inhabited, and it's home to some really gorgeous mountainous rainforests. And this is a place where you can add exotic bird species to your list. That bird in the lower left there, if you can see it, is a kagu. It's flightless, it's a ground bird. And I stumbled on it quite literally in a place called the Parc des Grandes Fougères, which is named for these giant tree ferns that grow, up to 7 stories, and they give this forest a truly primeval feel. And the birds are known locally as ghosts of the forest, in part because they're so elusive. But this one very obligingly ran toward me while I was fumbling to get my camera up and aimed. And fortunately, my companion on the hike behind me was had a good camera and took a good photo. But we had no idea what we were looking at until we showed the photo to the park ranger later, and we were very lucky indeed. The kagu is considered among the rarest birds in the world, and there are only about 1,000 of them left. Now, New Caledonia is the site of research aviaries for the University of Auckland, where researchers are doing some really fascinating work on the New Caledonian crow. The research team, they keep the birds in the aviary for just a few months while they test them, and then they release them back into the wild. And they name all the birds. They're Maya, Luigi, Ruby, Joker. And a few years ago, a New Caledonian crow named 007, after the famous spy, starred in a short film produced by the BBC for a program called Inside the Animal Mind. And the film showed 007 solving this elaborate 8-stage puzzle shown in the illustration. Now, I spent time in New Caledonia with Alex Taylor of the University of Auckland, who thought up this experiment. Now, 007, the bird, had seen the different parts of the puzzle, but he had never seen them in this particular configuration. And to get at the little cube of meat in the food chamber at the end of the puzzle, on the left there marked 8, this bird had to work out the steps in proper order, use one tool to get another tool, to get another tool, all of which he did in a little over 2 minutes. Now, Alex Taylor told me that the really clever part is this: doing what this bird is doing, which is aiming a tool at an object that's not food itself, but that the bird deems useful to secure another tool. That's known as meta-tool use, and it has been seen only in humans and great apes. And this multi-step puzzle task also demands working memory, which is the ability to keep in mind thoughts or goals while solving a problem. And it's a vital component of intelligence. But the birds are really champion problem solvers, but they're primarily renowned for their ability to make and use their own sophisticated tools. Now, they're the only species other than humans to make hook tools, which is what this bird is doing. It's a stick with a little hook on the end that the bird uses to grab insect larvae from holes in trees and plants. And the next video is going to show you an adult showing its young how to use the hook tool.
Hey, Jennifer, for the movie, we first watch the movie and then you comment, because we cannot have your voice and the movie at the same time.
Yes, I just announced that what was in the movie, so.
Okay.
I think it's quite amazing that young bird hands the tool back to the older bird, to the parent. So the crows also make very elaborate hook tools from the leaves of pandanus trees, and these leaves, they have little barbs along the edge that the bird uses to latch onto grubs. And it takes a lot of complicated steps to make these tools. And here's the remarkable thing: the bird makes several methodical cuts and tears in the leaf before removing the fully crafted tool from the leaf. So that suggests that they have an image of the tool in their heads before they actually start making it. And scientists have found that the birds have different styles of tool making in different parts of the island, which are passed down from adults to young. So transmitting tool design over generations, that's a very good definition of culture. So scientists all over the world are trying to figure out what makes these birds so special. Is it some particular quality of their brains or their genes? Is it something in their island environment? Researchers are sorting through these questions, and they're probing the genomes and the behaviors of these birds and comparing them with other crows that live in similar and different environments. So, New Caledonian crows, they're really renowned for their technical smarts, their ability to solve technical physical problems. Birds have many other sorts of intelligence, social, for instance. They cultivate lasting relationships with mates and allies, like this pair of great crested grebes. Birds collaborate, sometimes selflessly helping another bird get a reward with no gain for themselves. And some birds even appear to grasp what is going on in another bird's mind, a highly sophisticated a social and emotional skill known as theory of mind. Now, a good example of this is the Eurasian jay. I'm going to show you this little video. So Eurasian jays, they court their mates by bringing them food, which is pretty standard in the bird world. But here's what's intriguing. A male jay, he makes the choice about what kind of treat to offer his mate based not on his own appetites, but on what she has eaten before. So, birds, like people, they prefer a variety of foods and they can fill up on too much of one thing. So the male jay, in an effort to please the female, keeps track of what she has eaten and her shifting food preferences. So it's kind of like he thinks, I can see she's had too much cheese. I think I'll bring her some fruit. However, the food in question here is actually mealworms and waxworms, which are kind of the Belgian truffles of the jay world. And if the female has eaten her fill of of mealworms, the male will actually bring her a waxworm, regardless of his own food preferences. So he seems to understand that his mate has a mind with thoughts and desires that differ from his own. And this is a critical component of social intelligence and often considered the foundation of empathy. So, can a bird actually be empathetic? Well, this is Thomas Bunyar, who's a scientist at the University of Vienna, and he has shown that ravens, at least, appear to be capable of empathy. They respond to the emotional states of other ravens, especially mates and allies. If one bird is the victim of a conflict, its mate or ally will recognize it is in distress and console it by preening it or twining bills with it, which is kind of the bird equivalent of kissing. Another sort of bird intelligence, an apparent sense of artistry, appears in an extraordinary family of birds that live in Australia and New Guinea, the bowerbirds. There are many different species. This is a satin bowerbird in southeastern Australia. And these are spotted bowerbirds. Now, all bowerbirds build special bowers to woo females, and these are little archways or other structures that are made of sticks, and they're adorned with an array of colorful or shiny objects. And I want to emphasize these are not nests. There's no rearing of young that takes place in these bowers. Rather, they are kind of theaters of seduction. They're the stage that the male uses as a backdrop for this little wooing song and dance he performs to try to win a mate. Now, female satin bowerbirds, they are very selective about which males they will mate with. So they prefer males who build bowers that are really superbly crafted, symmetrical, dense with uniform sticks. So a hopeful male must find straight, slender sticks of just the right length, hundreds of them, which he packs into these two thick, curved, symmetrical walls. And it's really artistry and craftsmanship at its finest. So when a female appears in the bower, she's the one in the little archway there, the male launches into this wild performance to impress her. It's a kind of frenetic ballet of hops and dances, songs. He picks up objects from his collection and he throws them in the air. He flares his wings and he bulges his eyes and he runs dramatically back and forth across the platform, kind of doing all kinds of mimicry. He imitates the crazy laughing calls of kookaburras and the shrieks of cockatoos. Well, meanwhile, while all this is going on, the female, she sits in the archway and she judges all this with a highly critical eye. She's gauging and measuring his skills and comparing them in her mind with other males and their performance. She's very picky. Only the male who puts on the best show and builds the best decorated bower will win a mating with her. Now, female satin bowerbirds, they like blue decorations, lots of them. So males are constantly trying to add to their collection, and they sometimes do so in very unscrupulous ways. For instance, they may steal from a neighbor's bower while its owner is away, or they may raid a picnic site for a stash of plastic straws and bottle caps like this bird apparently did. Each species of bowerbird has its preferred ornaments, which are very carefully selected. This is a great bowerbird, which generally favors green and white things, bleached snail shells, stones, and bones, which this one may have found in a nearby cemetery. Spotted bowerbirds like shiny things. Now, this is a bower I found in Eastern Australia, and it was just packed with green glass and screws, bits of jewelry, and these clear glass marbles that are in the base of the arch there. There was one spotted bird that built its bower near the house of a stained glass artist, and it was filled with little pieces of stained glass, which the bird had actually sorted by color, laying out the pieces just like a mosaic. Kind of like the design of this bower, which belongs to a vogelkop bowerbird of New Guinea, and it's made of little piles of blossoms and fruit that are sorted by color. Now, the mental skills that I've mentioned so far, artistry, problem solving, tool making, those are all things that we humans generally tend to do fairly well ourselves. But birds also have capacities that go well beyond ours, including wildly impressive spatial skills, like those nutcrackers that hide and later find those thousands of hidden seeds, or this bird, the rufous hummingbird. It lives in the mountains of the western US, and this hummingbird can recall not only the location of a particular flower it has fed on in a vast field of flowers, but it can remember when it fed on that particular flower, returning to it only after the flower has had time to replenish its nectar. So different kinds of flowers have different rates of nectar replenishment. And this bird stores this what, where, and when information about hundreds of flowers in a brain only about the size of a grain of rice. I think likewise impressive is the ability of migratory birds like this osprey to know where it's going, to navigate to its destination, even if it's thrown off course by hundreds or even thousands of miles. How do birds do this, with a tiny brain and no mobile phone? Well, scientists believe that birds navigate with a collection of mental tools that are really the natural equivalent of our compasses, our GPS, our satellite navigation. They use all these different kinds of information from sun and stars, magnetic fields, landscape features, wind, sound, even smell, all funneled into their brains and then used to guide them to their destinations. Now, that's the compass part. Birds also carry in their brains a mental map, but the nature of that map is really still largely a mystery. We do know that the maps that some birds carry in their heads can be enormous, encompassing whole continents or even the globe. Now, the story I like to tell about this concerns an experiment with a flock of white-crowned sparrows on the west coast of North America. And the birds were migrating south from their breeding grounds up in Alaska and Canada to their wintering grounds in Mexico. And while the birds were on their way south along the west coast, researchers captured 30 of them, 15 adults and 15 juveniles. And they packed all the sparrows into crates, flew them by small aircraft all the way across the country, 2,300 miles from their normal migratory route, flight route, to a release site in Princeton, New Jersey. There, they let the birds go to see if they could find their route back to their wintering grounds. Well, within the first few hours of release, the adult sparrows had reoriented themselves and set off traveling solo across the continent, aiming directly at Mexico. Even the youngest adults who had only made the migratory journey once in their lives found their bearings and headed for their winter home. So, people often ask me, so what can we learn by studying bird intelligence? And for one thing, I think we can learn something about how our own brains work. As I said, birds learn their songs the way we learn language. And indeed, the similarities are really remarkable, from the process of imitating and practicing right down to the brain pathways involved and even the genes within those pathways. Also, when birds sleep, their brains show similar cycles of slow wave and REM sleep that ours do. So, for these reasons and others, I think birds are turning out to be these, great models for understanding our own brains and cognition, how and why we sleep, how we learn language, and even how speech evolved in the first place. But I think, in my view, what's most exciting about this field is the possibility of learning how another creature thinks, how a bird's mind works, and what it can teach us about the nature of intelligence itself. So after reading my books, I really hope that people will come to see the birds around them, the hummingbirds, jays, finches, sparrows, a little differently as the clever, thoughtful, innovative creatures they are. And maybe also to question what intelligence is and whether there might be kinds of genius, ways of knowing in the natural world that go beyond our own. And finally, I hope people will come to care even more about the survival of birds in our changing world. The great naturalist and writer Rachel Carson once said that the more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of life around us, the less taste we shall have for its destruction. And, now more than ever, I probably don't have to tell this group, but the feathered geniuses around us are threatened by habitat destruction and climate change. And now more than ever, we really have to work hard to make sure that our children and our children's children have the chance to see the birds that we see and to learn from them and from their, very marvelous and still very mysterious ways of knowing. So I'd like to thank people who contributed images to this talk. And many thanks to all of you for listening, to Raffaella for translating. Thank you all so much. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with me at any point if you have questions or comments. And please do keep a lookout for my new book on owls, which will be published in June here in the States and will eventually come out in a Portuguese version in Brazil next year, or maybe, I hope, or possibly the year after. Thank you so much.
Jennifer, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I love the book, and I like it even more after watching your presentation. I want also to use the opportunity to thank your publisher, Editora Fósforo, for putting us together. So I have a question for you. I know you've published books on different subjects other than birds, but I can see there's a special passion for birds. You have a special relationship with them. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, as I said in the presentation, I've loved birds since I was a child, they've just been with me all my life. The first book that I wrote was a book that had a lot of natural history about shorebirds and migratory birds, and then I drifted off into other areas. But I came back to birds when I began to see these reports about their cognitive abilities, and I just got really interested in coming back around to really what was one of my first loves, and I'd never stopped bird watching. It's been a passion all my life. So, and now that since The Genius of Birds was published, I'm all birds all the time now. I've written The Bird Way, and then the Owl book, which is coming up soon. So I love to write about birds.
I hope the Owl book gets translated to Portuguese as well.
It's supposed to. So I hope so.
A few years ago, Irene Pepperback has been here, and actually, she went birding with us for one day in São Paulo. So, are you planning to come birding in Brazil as well? Is it in your bucket list?
It is very high on my bucket list, probably at the top. I'm very eager to get to Brazil. I've been to Brazil twice, but not with the time to actually do the birding as much as I'd like to. So yes, I have a daughter who lives in Brazil, so I have lots of excuses to go there. And the next trip I go, I'm going to spend a lot of time bird watching.
Okay, that'll be nice. So before your presentation, while we were chatting, we talked a little bit about intelligence and cognition. Would you elaborate a little bit more on that? And
Yeah.
especially because the name of the book in Portuguese talks about intelligence, while in English it's about the genius of birds.
Yes. Yes, it's interesting. I mean, different countries have chosen different ways of describing the whole idea of intelligence or cognition. And I chose the word genius for the English edition because it embraces, I think, both what we consider, intelligence in our own definition of it, but it also includes I think the genius of the natural world of evolutionary adaptation. And so, as some of the so it carries this double meaning. And in intelligence, the word itself means lots of different things to different people. And as I said in the presentation too, our definitions of intelligence are still forming, even in our own species, and certainly in the larger world of animals, and also our ability to measure or even understand the capacities of other creatures is really just in its infancy.
Thank you. So now we have a few questions from our audience here. The first one is coming from Rosindia. She is asking about the parrots. Can we then say that the species that are more talkative of parrots, that she means, that are very common in the pet trade, do they really talk? They're not just mimicking. They're really.
Yeah, I think part of my uh, yeah, they're not just mimicking. For instance, the African gray parrot, Alex, he could use hundreds of words, and he really used them in a meaningful way. He could make sentences. And so this is not mere mimicry. He was forming his own sentences. And, people who have pet parrots tell me that their birds come out with the darndest things, and it's not necessarily something that they've said or that their bird could possibly have heard in, in the same format or whatever. That the birds are, I think some birds anyway, are capable of much more than just mimicry.
And then there's a question by Fernanda Fernandex. She asked about owls. Which ones are the smarter or the less smart? And how's their memory? How does their brain works?
Yes, well, that's I dive into that in the new book. One of the really wonderful stories that a scientist who works with barred owls told me. I asked him about the intelligence of owls, because they have while they have a reputation for wisdom, they also have a reputation for not being the smartest of birds. And he said, well, okay, he has to tag barred owls in order to, he tags them with GPS devices, and then he has to retrieve the devices. Well, he has figured out how to train barred owls. So he puts down a dead mouse, waits for the barred owl to come in, and then he whistles. He does this 3 times. Dead mouse, bird comes in, whistles again. He does this 3 times, and after 3 times, he can whistle and the bird will come in. Now, you asked about memory. He had one bird that who he named Houdini because he kept slipping off out of his GPS tracker device. But this bird remembered after a period of 3 years. Rob hadn't been back to this particular place to visit with this particular bird for 3 years, and he whistled, and Houdini came in for his mouse. So there's a lot more going on, and I think than we realize, and we're just beginning to sort it out. It involves getting inside a bird's head, and that's just a really challenging thing.
And so we have another question from Mario Conhaft, the ornithologist from the Amazon, actually from Manaus.
Yes.
He is asking, well, he said, Jennifer, great talk. And he comments, you travel all over the place for your research, but the bird continent, South America, and the diversity capital, the Amazon, were conspicuously underrepresented. When are you coming to Brazil to remedy the situation?
Now, this is just so true and such fair criticism. I will say that I spent a lot of time in Brazil on the Owl book. I worked with a team of Brazilian researchers. So Brazil is featured prominently in the Owl book. And also my next book, it's all going to be South America all the time. I'm really, really excited about about exploring the birds of the continent and some of the really interesting behaviors that we're just beginning to observe and tease apart.
There was there's an additional question that came. The parrot, here's the Congo parrot. I don't know how to translate that. Like Alex, can be considered as intelligent as a crow?
Yeah, I think people would say that, in fact, there's some kinds of parrots. The Kia, for instance, is every bit, I think, as intelligent as a corvid. You know, they're way up there, both parrots and corvids, and you know, which is smarter. I don't know. I don't think we know how to measure that yet, but the Kia, which is featured in my book on the birdway, is an incredible problem solver and just a very smart bird. So yeah, I think you know, we have a ways to go before we understand who's at the top of the heap.
Well, there's this method developed by this Brazilian neuroscientist, right? That is perhaps a way to measure intelligence.
Yes.
And in fact, I remember discussions about that way back when Stephen Jay Gould published this book. I think it was either the Pandastam or the Mismeasure of Man. I don't know.
Yeah.
He discusses a little bit about brain size relative to body size and this whole thing, but
yeah, but it's really the density of neurons, and I think Susanna Herculano Uzel has just done brilliant work on this, and she's going to get to the bottom of it, at least in terms of neuron count, and that certainly is a big piece of it.
Yeah, it was just fantastic. So we don't have any additional questions, but perhaps you'd like to say something else to our audience?
Well, I just I long to be there with you all and to see your birds and to learn from you. I'm eager. I hope maybe next year to be able to join you in person. And you know, in the meantime, I just thank you so much for listening, and again to the organizers for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure. Erika, it has been a joy to talk with you and to learn a little bit about your work, which sounds so important. So, so many thanks to everyone.
Well, Thank you, and we are certainly going to keep in touch and hope to see you here.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.